So by 2014, you have websites like SoundCloud that's emerging, that's starting to give an ear to other artists that you wouldn't regularly hear on the radio. So that's just hip hop on a whole. And then you also have now, obviously iPhones and just phones, period. They're starting to expand in their capabilities and apps. They're becoming more useful. And so now, slowly, you have these music apps like Spotify as the streaming era starts to emerge. And then websites like, at that time, Dat Piff, one of the main mixtape websites, starting to fade away. And Apple Music, by the way, was big. A lot of people just buying the album. You would actually like download music, not just stream it, but purchase it and buy it when iTunes was still a thing. All right, so in the mid 2010s, that's where we're at. So let's start in 2014. By 2014, Christian hip hop had reached a historic milestone. This was huge for the history. Lecrae's album Anomaly became the #1 album across all categories. I'm gonna say that one more time. A Christian hip hop artist with a Christian hip hop album that was unashamed, and that thing was, to this day, I still consider one of Lecrae's best albums, if not his best album, Anomaly. It was golden. Peak at its peak. This album was #1 across all categories, not just gospel, not just in the Christian categories and charts. We're talking about hip hop, period. It was the #1 hip hop album, #1 Christian album, all across. And boy, did that start shifting the game. It not only started shifting Christian hip hop in itself, but just the entire hip hop industry. If eyes weren't already watching with some of the feats from Lecrae himself, from some other artists, eyes were watching now. And let me tell you, the trajectory of CHH, it was foreshadowed in these moments. And so where we're at right now, we got to see glimpses of this just like we have in the decades prior. So 2014, huge milestone. To be honest, Christian hip hop wouldn't be here without the impact that Anomaly had in the game. And the way God just literally breathed on that project, it was crazy. For the first time in history, we have a Christian hip hop artist that had #1 in the entire country. But this success did not settle the conversation about Christian hip hop. If anything, it just made it louder. It just made it either for some more confusing or more indignant of what Christian hip hop was or where it was going. That's what it did. Because around this time, Lecrae began saying some things. He was, once again, there was a shift happening. Lecrae began saying something that would spark debate across the culture. He would say, I am a Christian who raps. I am not a Christian rapper. But we had explained earlier what led up to it too, and just the building of not only CHH, but in Lecrae's career and what he was doing and the shift in the game and what led to that point. It was huge. For some, it made sense. Some understood it right away, and they knew what Lecrae was on. They knew how he was trying to reach not only just the Christian circles, the church, but outside of the church. Hint, church closed. Some people understood the shift and where he was getting at. And some were the beneficiaries of that album or that mixtape and those projects or that shift. He was going to those outer circles. That impacted me personally, and that actually helped to solidify my faith in Christ, watching him from afar. For some listeners, that distinction, it made sense. They got it. It's like, okay, we see what you're doing. We know what you're on. Matter of fact, we're some of the beneficiaries of that because from those who come from the street life and we understand, it makes sense. But for others, it felt like he was abandoning the space. It felt like it was too much change going on. It wasn't just who he was reaching. They felt like he was abandoning CHH, period. Like, is he still a Christian rapper? Is he abandoning Christ? Is he abandoning his faith? Kind of lean towards that way with some people. This conversation, it wasn't just a theological one. Like, are Christians, can they just be an artist who is a Christian? How explicit and bold do you have to be? It's been a big debate. Like, if there was a Muslim who was a rapper, like Lupe, do we outright call him, oh, that's Muslim hip hop? That's a Muslim rapper. People usually don't. They identify him as a hip hop artist who is a Muslim. And so Lecrae, he was wrestling with that, debating that. There was tension there. This conversation wasn't just theological, it was cultural. It demanded the culture to wrestle with this, not only from the church within itself, but even outside of the church and people looking in. Was Christian hip hop a genre? What exactly is Christian hip hop? And that question still surfaces to this day. People still trying to figure that out, still trying to define it, as we talked about in our very first episode. And people are wondering, like, okay, yeah, it's Christian hip hop. Is it a subgenre? Which to this day, it definitely is. Christian hip hop is its own subgenre of hip hop. It is. Thank God it is too. In the years after Anomaly, Christian hip hop continued to expand in some of these lanes. So that question opened a door, and that door opened a new era of experimentation. Some artists began exploring new sounds and creativity within the space. Artists like Andy Mineo experimented with not only new music sounds, new styles, but also just his storytelling approaches and just his creative approach and direction for his artistry. He started expanding some of the concepts and creativity around CHH. Projects like Uncomfortable and later releases pushed the boundaries of what Christian hip hop could sound like. To this day, I mean, shout out to Magic Bird 2. The album is crazy. I mean, just crazy. They spaz on that. If anything, some would even argue that out of the Reach record lineup, throughout the entire time of Reach Records, Andy Mineo was definitely one of the most creative ones in the space. Shout out to also Sho Baraka, who's bold and took some creative risk or new approaches as well. Derek Minor, formerly known as Pro, and then even Lecrae himself, obviously the GOAT, who kind of led the way as well. But some would say Andy Mineo was one of the ones who took that creativity and kept going with it as well. Another artist, Aha Gazelle. Man, he was one of the first ones to talk about certain topics, or as boldly as he did, it was still prevalent within the space. Like, he made Christian hip-hop cool in some type of way. But honestly, he was just being authentic to himself. So whether it's talking about money, girls, or race issues, he didn't mind, and he was blunt with it too. And he was lyrical. The wordplay was there. His wordplay is one of the best. And I think that's why people go to him for verses, for features every time. Projects like, to this day, Free Barabbas, which has been a stamp in Christian hip hop. So the culture was expanding creatively, but with that new expansion came the discussion. Because the sound was diversifying more, because more artists were emerging, and once again, we're in a streaming era, so new artists are popping up, and people are tuning in to different artists that otherwise you wouldn't have heard unless they were signed to a major label, or they were, making waves on the radio and whatnot with usually the help of a label. So now the SoundCloud era is starting to emerge, and the streamings era is starting to emerge, and you have new artists. Even though Aha Gazelle did end up making his way being signed with Reach Records, the space was expanding. As the sound diversified, it became harder to define exactly what is Christian hip hop. Around the same time, another lane started emerging. These type of artists, I'm gonna call them adjacent artists, all right? They're adjacent to the space. These are artists who clearly carry Christian values or influence, but they don't necessarily identify themselves as part of the Christian hip hop space. So for all intents and purposes, we'll call these artists undercover. You can call them undercover if you want. Maybe their first label that Lecrae used, just artists who are Christian. Or right now, we'll call them adjacent artists. And one of the most visible artists at that time, we're talking about in the 2010s, late 2010s, in the 2010s, man, NF was a big thing. And boy, did he take over. NF's music contained themes, especially early on. You could tell NF was more forthcoming about his Christian values and, what he believed. But he rarely positioned himself inside of the Christian hip-hop movement. As he started popping off and eventually signed with Capital Christian Music Group, you start seeing that shift, and he became an adjacent artist. And his audiences, they extended way far beyond than just the Christian hip-hop circle. The market with Eminem's fan base, I'm sure he was pulling from that. There was obviously some similarities there, but they were flocking to him or hating on him. It was reminiscent of some of Eminem's early times, but just cleaner. You had all of the white boys and girls who they flocked towards NF. They did. People in general, in Christian hip hop, black or white. So it's like Lecrae made history, and then NF, especially not only because he's white and sounds like Eminem. I mean, come on. Not only because he's white and he's clean, but he's skilled as well. And some of the topics that he was talking about that people could relate, being in that adjacent lane, man, he was topping them charts. He was killing it. People were eating it up both in the church and out, which again raises the question, what exactly is Christian hip hop? But the identity conversation within Christian hip hop was building tension. Because by the late 2010s, something else started happening. It wasn't just who was emerging from the space or adjacent to the space. It was artists that was known outside of the space starting to come in. If you know what I'm referring to, in the late 2010s, we had none other than Kanye West stepping into the scene.